Welcome to the first episode of Cinder Bloc Radio, a Red May podcast about world-making and world-breaking practices and the material conditions of life through late capitalism and, hopefully, life after. Cinder Bloc looks to contemporary analyses to better struggle and better understand our struggles against capital and its ancillaries, as well as point to new, speculative futures toward imagining better lives in common, lives we want to live, against the horizon of the current world that we endure. I'm one of your hosts, Sean. I'm here with Kyle.
Hey, everybody.
We're both organizers with Red May in Seattle, which is an annual month-long celebration of communist and socialist philosophy, theory, and arts. To find out more, go to redmayseattle.org or watch some of our previous events at youtube.com/redmaytv.
We have three guests for part one of a two-part series today. Jarrod Kurti and Jarrod Shanahan write for and are on the editorial board of Hardcrackers magazine, which can be found in print and online at hardcrackers.com. We're also joined today by Phillip Neel, a communist geographer and author of the book Hinterland, published with the Brooklyn Rail and Reaction books. In today's episode, we reflect on the recent U.S. presidential election and its relationship to the George Floyd uprisings of this summer. In particular, we discuss what the summer can and cannot tell us about upcoming political struggle, defunding the police, real social division in the U.S. today, and the potential of right-wing formation under Democrat presidents.
You're listening to Tyga Paw from the 2020 album Get Free, and this is Cinder Bloc Radio. We make abstract concrete. So here in the U.S., we just had an election. It broke a 100-year record for voter turnout. Something between 65-66% of eligible voters came out to participate. We're also coming off the heels of the George Floyd Rebellions, a sort of generalized conflict and revolt that happened on a scale not seen in the U.S. for at least the past half century. Despite all this, we were told that, come November, after the presidential election, things would be even more escalated, that the fighting would be more intense, more pervasive. Yet things certainly feel calmer today than they did in June or July. Aside from, of course, the conditions of the pandemic. So Jarrod and Jana, can you walk us through some of the events this summer that led up to this election, as well as maybe what led us to get the election so wrong?
Well, so in our piece in Brooklyn Rail, we talked a little bit about kind of these two moments that converged on the streets of the United States. The first being two catalysts. The first being the murder of George Floyd, who was going to a store and was the police was called on because he was allegedly counterfeiting a $20 bill, and this was happening in the midst of a global pandemic, right? That was hitting the United States particularly very hard. The Trump administration botching the response to it, particularly the pandemic, revealing these important kind of race and class divides in American life. So these two things coming together, and really the murder of George Floyd, right? This white police officer putting his foot on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes, and America watching him die on camera, right, was this catalyst for thousands upon thousands of people to take to the streets and to protest police brutality. And, we really saw this moment of protest as, police brutality really kind of being emblematic of really the tip of the iceberg in American life, right? Like historically, moments of crisis, right? If we think about back to the 60s, have been precipitated. Police brutality has been the tinder that has, that has sparked forth the flame. And similarly today, we saw a similar response to this really egregious form of state violence, right? That was very visible. And, Jarrod, feel free to jump in, but I just want to say that, as we talk about in that article, this was just kind of the last in a long series of police murders, right? Prior to that, in March was the murder of Breonna Taylor, who was killed by a police officer serving a no-knock warrant in a part of Louisville, Kentucky that was being gentrified, right? So we kind of saw like policing and the war on drugs being an important background to her murder. So, and just countless other names, right, that have been kind of an ongoing in American life, and that so many Americans have been privy to because of social media, right? So many non-Black Americans have, kind of recognized that this is something that happens daily, right? It's not, so.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jana, and I think as a result of the confluence of all these factors at once, there have actually been several movements layered on top of one another, and this actually explains a lot of conflict that we've seen in the streets. I mean, on the first case, there's a fairly narrowly defined movement against police brutality and seeking police accountability, and this is consistent with what I understand to be the major trend in the 2014 incarnation of Black Lives Matter. Simultaneously, you have a more militant and particularly Black rebellion against the structural racism in the United States. And a lot of these folks cut their teeth in 2014, and the failure of police reform to stop the murder of Black men in the streets, along with a host of other, very obvious symptoms of a society that does not value Black life, have radicalized a lot of activists toward a very particular form of a Black revolution. And then in the third case, I think that there's even more generally, just a generalized rebellion against almost all facets of American life. COVID is indispensable in understanding the sheer numbers and the anger and passion that have gone into these demonstrations. And I think a lot of people are learning, certainly Black people who already knew this, and a whole lot of white people are learning just how little their lives matter in American society. And you see this just generalized rebellion against the American way of life. And given the way that the American public sector is organized, if you are very likely to associate the figure of the state and the figure of power itself with the police officer. If you live in an over-policed neighborhood, this is a very direct tie to make. If you live in a slightly less policed neighborhood, you probably notice that just about every year, the cops in your town have a brand new car, while you're hearing on the news that everybody needs to tighten their belt. And so I think we can talk a little bit more, I think, about why it is exactly that police infrastructure, police cars, and courthouses were particular targets of great, violence in this movement. But it really just makes perfect sense in the context of how American society is organized, how austerity has functioned, and I think that there is great opportunity, I think, for the Black folks who have been in this struggle for a long time, and some of the white people who might just be coming to think about these questions for the first time, to find a lot of common ground as these kind of interrelated struggles unfold.
Yeah, and I'm curious about how we understand the relationship of the pandemic to what happened over the summer, in the sense that this isn't the first wave of anti-police revolts that the U.S. has seen. Both of you had mentioned back to Ferguson, Baltimore, obviously even further back to the 60s. It's one of those things where it's unclear why a certain police murder is going to spark off some type of revolt or rebellion. But like, how can we understand the dynamics of the pandemic, particularly in related to people's way of life otherwise being largely upended, people having maybe more idle time, or the components of sort of immediately losing their job? Like, what do we think the relationships are there?
I would say very quickly that the best explanation I've heard is that this is what happens when Americans aren't working 50, 60 hours a week. There's this popular myth that American proletarians have been, bought off or are subdued by, some variety of comfort and mass culture. But I mean, I think that the millions of people, so upwards of 26 million people who have taken the streets in this rebellion, really attest to an alternative explanation to that, which is that American life is very hard. People have to work very hard. Much of your time does not belong to you, and what little precious time you have away from work, school, family obligations, it could typically be spent in different forms of escapism. Substance abuse being, probably the primary one. And so I think that this just goes to show that there's a lot of revolutionary potential in the American working class. If we can pry people away from their pressing life obligations for a little while.
I just want to add and say, although we can never predict, right, when folks are going to respond to an act of state violence, right, and kind of take to the streets. I mean, I think, what Jarrod and I try to do, and I think all of us to some degree can agree on, is that there is this wider context, right? For, there was a first wave of BLM that certainly politicized so many young people. It brought attention to police brutality to mainstream America, right? In a way that we haven't seen before, again, due to social media. We've seen just so many, Black and brown people be killed by police. We have seen Trump's response to calls for law and order, right? And the emergence of this thin blue line, and really drawing a divide in American life between, those who support law enforcement and who want to return to law and order, and, this imaginary past that may have never benefited them to begin with, right? And then this, very pro Black Lives Matter critique of police brutality. So that was also brewing in the background, right? We have to kind of remember that, George Floyd also happened in the midst of a Trump administration that, was deporting immigrants. Liberals had taken to the streets, were moved by a lot of what Trump did, and, to some degree were radicalized, right? And then on top of that, there's this pandemic where all we're doing is we're at home, we're quarantined, and we're just watching news and just bodies in these morgues, day after day, right? Like the numbers are rising. There are those that believe in the virus, those that are don't, but, for sure people are dying, right? And then millions of people are left unemployed. At that point, there was very, what would happen in terms of stimulus money, what would happen in terms of how people would, take care of themselves in this moment of crisis. We saw hospitals be overwhelmed, right? So like American life was really coming apart. And it's just this crisis that we have been living with for so long, right? For decades, that definitely was heightened during Occupy. And, and all these protests have kind of chipped that. But I would say COVID really laid the crisis bare in this really important way. And that together with the George Floyd murder, just, like most Americans, Black Americans specifically, were like, damn, nobody could catch a break, right? Like even amidst a crisis, the police cannot take a break from killing people, right? And really make clear that the police, that is their job, is to maintain and reproduce the social order. And in that process, it also means violence, right? In that process, it also means criminalization of poverty. And then oftentimes the end result of that criminalization of poverty is taking someone's life, right? So I think all of those things were important in why George Floyd.
If I could just jump on that very quickly. The police proved themselves during the early days of the pandemic to be actually less than useless, because it wasn't as if they were neutral. They couldn't do anything to stop the spread of the disease, right? All of this policing infrastructure, all of these prisons that the United States has dumped its money into over the last 45 years, it wasn't just useless, it was worse than useless, because it was spreading the virus. And police walking around without masks to this day, demanding that people engage with them at a very close range, and locking people up in these jails that have become global hotspots of COVID. So the police aren't just useless in this situation, they're less than useless. And a second component of that is something that I think is really reminiscent of the 1960s, although of course we have all been scolded about shop-worn historical analogies. But you see in the present this dynamic that occurred in the mid-1960s, where the police, as an organized political force, organized through their unions, organized through their affinity with local and national right-wing politicians, get locked into this dynamic with the movement, and they just radicalize the hell out of each other. So many of the younger Black Lives Matter folks in Chicago, where I live, have discussed the radicalizing experience of the first mobilization we had here immediately after George Floyd's murder, in which they and their friends and the people around them were just wantonly brutalized by the police. Simultaneously, the police have become an increasingly organized and coherent ultra-right force in the United States. On the eve of the election, I attended a Trump rally in Kenosha, Wisconsin. In a lot of ways, it was like a scene from Hieronymus Bosch. And there were blue line flags everywhere, and I saw this one guy had a shirt on with the Punisher logo, but the Punisher was made out of the thin blue line flag, and he was wearing Donald Trump's toupee. And then at a pivotal moment in the Trump's, rambling, 90-minute remarks, he said, looking on the crowd, I bet there's a lot of cops out there. I love the cops. Let's hear from you. And oh my God, hands were going up all throughout the crowd. And it's actually a very significant fact of this election, and I'll shut up after this, that Donald Trump was abandoned by very much of American official society as part of a very rare coordination between competing business interests, competing media interests, all of these kind of different class fragments and competing capitalists really did join forces to bury Donald Trump. When he said that there's a conspiracy against him, there actually fucking was. But standing alone and apart from this official society kind of ban on Trump, were just about every organization of law enforcement in the United States. And I think that that's a very significant fact, thinking about the political terrain moving forward, how organized they've become, how disciplined they are, and I think most especially how increasingly comfortable they are on the fringe right, without anybody else around them.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the election a little bit, and I also wanted to touch on some of the misconception that you brought up earlier about the working class sort of being bought off by maybe like fancy toys or mass media in a certain way, because I think there are some misconceptions about the election more broadly that we can go into, and I sort of Phil, I think you can jump in here on this, but I think there's two ways that we could think about the election and its relationship to the summer, in the sense that it does seem clear that a lot of energy from the summer was sort of piped into the election by some of the people that were involved in that. And you could look to the high turnout numbers and say, oh, that's an example of people being kind of sucked into the electoral process. But then, on the flip side, the numbers still aren't that high. And maybe there's another way to interpret those numbers that can sort of explain people's relationship to electoral politics and how maybe that was impacted by the events over the summer.
Yeah. So, as soon as an election happens in America, one thing starts to happen just kind of all over the political scene. Everyone's looking at these election numbers and they're kind of poring over them and they're making statements based on these numbers that are like, what does like the Black population think about politics based on how they voted in the election? How did white women vote, and how can we make generalizations about white women based on that number? This is always incredibly annoying to me personally for a couple reasons. First, of course, because I'm a communist. Second, because I'm a geographer who does a lot of data science stuff. And so this is like the basic data literacy things that we teach you not to do in like an intro to quantitative methods class or something. You have to pay attention to what your actual sample population is and what the structural kind of features that are affecting their responses are how that's going to affect what they're saying essentially in this sort of a data. So from election data, what are we actually looking at? What does election data actually show about American society or politics? Well, first, just in numerical terms, we're always talking about eligible voters, and we're always talking about some share of eligible voters. There's a lot of news that came out about how it was like the highest response for an election in many, many years in the US, something like 67%. But that 67% is averaged over the entire country, and it's averaged over very uneven geographies. What that means is that if you take that 67% and you kind of look in more detail about what states, what the response rate, the actual voter turnout was in individual states, it's actually very, very low in certain places still. So it's under 50% in many states, or around 50% all across much of the Southwest, across much of the South. And this is not just states that might be more liberal like California, which had very low turnout. It's also like, I believe that Mississippi and Alabama had extremely low turnout as well. So states that you might think they would normally turn conservative. The highest turnout was in a series of states that the Democratic Party targeted to get higher turnout. That's mostly in the Midwest. And then some states where you traditionally have higher turnout in Washington State, in parts of the Northeast, et cetera, et cetera. So in general, that voter turnout number actually it disguises the fact that even in like one of the most populous states in California, you had barely half of eligible voters actually coming and even voting. And then on top of that, you have to ask, well, who are even eligible voters in the American system? Eligible voters excludes like all immigrants, essentially, and not just undocumented, but also like legal resident immigrants. It excludes prisoners. It excludes kind of different state by state exactly how this works, but it excludes most felons. And then for anyone who's not familiar, or for international listeners, in America, if you get in a fight with a police officer and you go to court, you're going to be charged with a felony for that. That's a felony offense. And so if you say get in a fight with a cop at a rally and you get charged with it and it goes all the way through the court system, you're also stripped of your right to vote in America, most states in America. So that really restricts who we're even talking about when we're looking at these numbers. And then in addition to that, I just kind of want to mention briefly the fact of how voting really kind of works. I think a lot of Americans who have voted understand this sort of intuitively when you're presented with a ballot, like unless you're, someone who really believes in the system or whatever. And I think those people are more and more rare today. And they're generally going to be, wealthier. I think everyone's had this experience of getting the ballot and taking a look at it and saying, okay, like which one of these choices just fucks with shit the most? Like, which one of these things can I choose that just shows that I hate having to do this? Like that none of these are really my choice. Someone I just gave a talk with for this Italian crowd, I was giving a talk with this other American, and I'm going to steal a phrase that he used. He explained it as most Americans vote out of spite, right? We vote out of hatred. It's not a thing where we're expressing our earnest political opinions. It's really something that's not getting at what it seems to be getting at. So when people talk about the fact that the election results show a divide in America, in some ways that's true. But the deeper divide is not really the divide that's shown in the election results. There's another divide beneath that, and that divide is the divide between the people who maybe believe in that voting system and the people who think it's nonsense, the people who don't vote, or the people who vote purely out of spite, or the people who recognize, right, that there's all these structural problems with the US that can't be changed by voting. The truth is, if you look at every American election, something that I always point out is that if you were to categorize not participating and not voting as a actual candidate, you know, voting for no one, then no one wins every time, sweeps every election. And that's the basic fact that we have to, I think, frame the election. So it's really wrong to take a look at the election numbers and to generalize from those things like these weird, wild statements about the population as such, you know.
It seems to me, Phil, that you're getting at something here that we've all been sort of working around in this discussion. I know Jarrod and Jana, you all have written about this both in your Brooklyn Rail piece, Prelude to a Hot Summer, as well as your interview with Ill Will. Jana, you explicitly addressed it in the interview as the real divide. You've all pointed to elevated divisions that are becoming increasingly clarified, both politically and in a wider global and social context. Would you all talk about that? What are you seeing as a real divide here?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, I think at the heart of that divide, and it kind of goes back also to Phil's points about election, is that, I mean, I think what we have been seeing for the past decade specifically, as social movements have ratcheted up, not only in the United States, but globally, right? And George Floyd being this really intense moment of struggle where looting was very widespread. You know, it is this disenchantment and disillusionment with the quote unquote fancy word neoliberalism, right? Which also means just kind of like, just like really morbid late capitalism that we're all experiencing, right? So I think in that way, right, that COVID really laid bare the fact that most American institutions do not function well. They are situated in a way that they constantly put profits over people, right? Policing being kind of a key example of just like the sheer brutality of the American state. But I would say like the divide is kind of the fact that neither party can really speak to the problems facing ordinary people, right? In many ways, Trump is better at it in the sense of the promises that he makes, in the ways that he captures the alienation, the disillusionment, the anger, the nihilism that's kind of evident in day-to-day America. And he's able to capture it politically and sell it to people, right? To sell it to, especially to folks that have been completely, left out of, of the discussion, right? Who are kind of seen as backwards, right? And let's think about it, right? Since the 60s, the dial has moved a lot to quote unquote urban America, right? Like in terms of funding, nonprofits, all of this work, right? So there is this intense and important geographical divide. And I think Phil is probably the better person to talk about this. But, I think the divide is that, neoliberalism just does not work for so many people. Certainly, and I think something to kind of bring it back to the current moment is that, it's like, this is the part of, like the Democratic push was, they didn't have to present people with an agenda to divide, right? To them, this divide was between kind of those quote unquote backward white supremacist Trump supporters and the rest of America who wants, neoliberal multiculturalism, right? And I would say that, of course, we all want multiculturalism, right? But the way that the neoliberal elites have kind of clung to it and tied to it has created kind of this divide, and they don't really also have a solution, right? Like the Democrats have no policy plan. They have not had a policy plan. Their policy plan was like, we just want to defeat Trump, right? We just want to get him out of office. And so I think in that way, so many people voted to defeat Trump, right? They didn't necessarily vote because they like the Democrats. But I do think it is significant that many people perhaps want a return to normalcy, right? Want the virus to end, want a vaccine to be put in place, want the Democrats to quote unquote do something. You know, and I think this is also the moment that we kind of find ourselves in terms of another divide that's happening, right? With like the rise of kind of social democrats or like progressive Democratic candidates that are trying to push Biden to the left or trying to push the Democrats to the left. So there's kind of all of these divides in American life, right? But I would say that there's not really a coherent way, coherent analysis that attempts to speak to where these divides are coming from, what are they a result of, and how can they be addressed, right? That takes us beyond just the scope of electoral politics.
If I could jump on that real quick, I'd like to circle back to something you said, John, a few minutes ago, about the way that that neoliberal capital, which once again it's just capitalism as it currently exists, right? That has incorporated a lot of the business-friendly aspects of the movements of the 60s and 70s, and incorporates a lot of the kind of academic theory of difference, things like intersectionality, that do not impact actually the distribution of power and property. And I'm very influenced by the writing of Matthew Lyons and the blog Three-Way Fight. And I think for a long time, those folks have been putting out this kind of warning. And Don Hammerquist, too, has been saying this for a long time, that a situation might arise when the anti-state right are the only serious revolutionaries on the radar of a lot of Americans at the exact moment when a critical mass of Americans are rejecting capitalism as it exists in the United States and are rejecting the state. And I think the real danger in the years ahead is if the far right, who I believe is affecting a significant recomposition right now around this Stop the Steal, pro-Trump rallies. The recent DC rally featured a lot of Nazis marching side by side with a lot of people who we would consider kind of normal conservatives, right? And this was a fact that we hadn't seen very much since the disaster of Charlottesville, right? These folks are going to have some momentum in the coming years, and they are going to want to associate all of the same neoliberal, cost-cutting, imperialist bullshit that's going to come out of the Biden administration with us in the minds of the very American working people that we would want to win over. And so, I mean, it's not something that we can solve in the abstract, right? But it's something that I'm increasingly afraid of as I see, the most diverse cabinet in American history has a woman in charge of spying on American citizens and has a Latino in charge of deporting people. Great, like this is just, it's such an obvious farce, and it's going to be obvious to a lot of people. It would just be a real shame if there was not a serious revolutionary current on the radar of your typical American worker in the coming years.
Yeah, and maybe that's a good place to talk about some of the recomposition of the right, particularly under a Biden presidency, or just sort of in general how the compositions of different movements, whether left or right, tend to relate to political candidates. And Phil, I don't know if you have something to add in here, but I know you've talked a little bit about the sort of the rise of the far right under Obama, and its particular relationship to Trump, and maybe that can tell us something a little bit about what to expect under Biden, and then just more broadly, like how much that matters, like whether it is the Biden, Democratic leadership that is sort of pushing for this, or whether a lot of these movements are actually responding to things more like on the street, like the George Floyd Rebellion.
Yeah, I like to think of this kind of moment that we're in right now as being kind of written down in history books maybe 10 years from now as the Civil War that never happened. Uh, Everyone was kind of predicting, I mean, and I mean like almost everyone here, in kind of a rare moment where something that maybe ultra left communists and anarchists would be talking about kind of all the time was suddenly taken up by just, liberals in the New York Times and the Nation and stuff like that, saying we're on the verge of a civil war. And it didn't happen right around the election. There was kind of a surprisingly muted response to the election, I would say, even on the right compared to what most people were actually expecting. There has been these attempts that Jarrod has been pointing out to kind of recompose around it. I would argue that thus far those haven't been particularly effective, but I would agree with the general trajectory that is maybe hinted at there. What this basically means is that there's a lot of things about this. You always have to be, I think, suspicious of these kind of narratives. They get this general purchase across all these factions. It usually signals that there's something a little bit more ideological going on there, that everyone kind of envisions the world in one way, and that way of envisioning the world is kind of caused by something else going on in the background. And so this Civil War discourse that emerged, right? It emerged at the time when it was pretty clear, if you actually analyze kind of the layout of where power was and who was actually doing what, that it wasn't really on the table, that like an open civil war wasn't on the table. There weren't the numbers for it in any regard. And most importantly, as was pointed out earlier, the different fractions of the ruling class, they were actually coming together more than ever before to kind of facilitate this transition, right? They were more unified than they had been previously. And there wasn't a mass movement of a scale to actually threaten that. I think that we forget the scale and intensity of mass movement that's sort of required for something like a civil war. Because the fact is, we've had moments of civil conflict, like open, violent, bloody civil conflict in the US before, and in many other countries, you've seen this before, that have escalated to a pretty extreme point without causing a civil war. I would say that there was much more civil conflict and much more open conflict in the US in like the 60s going into the 70s, and that also didn't result in a civil war. So what's really going on behind this? How do we really kind of measure these sort of things like right-wing resurgence and the prospect for a coup and all of that? One thing that you have to kind of do is you have to look at really who's participating and what's the what I think of as like the mass scale of participation. So how much are just kind of general regular people coming into this stuff, people who don't have like a political hobby on the side, how much are they coming in participating? I would say that the rebellion that happened over the summer had like one of the largest mass scale participation rates that we've seen in since the 60s and 70s. Like in terms of just people who don't have a political hobby on the side, just coming out and participating in some register, regardless of exactly what they're doing. Now, has the far right under Trump had that same thing going on? I would argue that it absolutely hasn't, especially when you actually compare it to the level of participation that the far right was getting under Obama. Under Obama was when the far right was actually truly resurgent at this kind of mass level, where its discourse was spreading, but also its actual participation in many of these areas kind of far out of the city. People were just joining into stuff that the early patriot groups and these militias kind of around them were doing at that time, and they could actually garner much wider kind of mass support in a base in these particular areas where they didn't have to bus everybody in to fight Antifa, That's really the character that is taken under Trump, where because Trump was in power, the far right lost its most important kind of point of opposition that got it mass participation, which is the point that Jarrod is making here, that you have these decrepit, completely corrupt and completely, especially like corrupt and weak-looking kind of democratic administrations that are just administering the world kind of as it presently is. Their whole line is that we need to keep things the same, things are good, and everyone's experience at the kind of popular level is that things are not good and that things should not stay the same. So when you have those people in power, then the far right is able to engender these conflicts with the federal, especially with the federal government, right? They engender these conflicts with the federal government. They get some degree of kind of mass support and participation and attention. And that's kind of how they grew through Obama. It's also how they grew under Clinton back in the 90s. And they tend to get pared down under Republican or right-wing administrations. And that paring down happens because part of them gets recruited into the state. So like a lot of these patriot guys went and joined ICE after Trump got elected because they knew they'd be allowed to do the shit that they wanted to do under Trump, and it had an official sanction on it. So that part is dangerous, right? But under Trump, it was still actually constrained historically by comparison. And at the same time, you get this breakaway force that no longer has kind of a mass base for the far right that it had under, or that it was starting to maybe get under Obama. They weren't really successful. But because they're broken off, it's all just these political hobbyists. It's all just the people who are already doing this shit before and who are really into it. And it's these new kids who've been radicalized just, via Reddit or whatever. And those kind of political hobbyists, when they feel this kind of mass shedding, where the fact that their kind of mass participation has decreased, they also become more spectacularly violent, and they start to focus just on these spectacles of confrontation with Antifa, and they stop doing the stuff that was actually more threatening that the old patriot movement did, which was things like service provision for the poor. Or if you look at international examples, like back when Golden Dawn was, big in Greece, they would go around and have like Greeks only food drive things where they would hand out food, but not to immigrants. Like that sort of thing is much more threatening at the mass scale because it gets like participation in these different registers. The far right under Trump has been just like these spectacular moments of violence, which the left focuses on a lot more because the violence targets them, right? Because they feel that weight a lot more, but they're feeling it in a register like the left, and particularly like vulnerable populations are the ones who are targeted by that far right violence. That far right violence increases in those moments, but it doesn't necessarily signal more mass participation. Now, the final point here is just that under Biden, what I think Jarrod said is true. You again get an equation for an actual resurgence of the far right. And we might, in retrospect, look back, depending on kind of how it breaks down, but we might in retrospect kind of look back and say, well, the Trump kind of phenomenon, in that period, Trump is really just a prologue to Trump. Like Trump could become kind of the signal or rallying point or like this weird mythic figure in the future for the far right that has much more force than Trump himself actually did. Because throughout, of course, Trump is reined in by the large capital interests. It's very clear. He doesn't really do that much in office. It's not as extreme as people portrayed it to be. It's pretty consistent with Obama's policies, all of that. But the way he's taken up kind of at this mass level of the far right, it remains to be seen. But the equation is now there where a conflict can emerge with the federal government, and everyone hates the federal government, and especially the federal government over under a president like Biden, someone that unpopular, right? And that has the elements necessary for potential mass participation in that sort of a rebellion that the far right can then enter in a different way, in a way that they couldn't enter this rebellion over the summer.
Just real quickly before you hop in, Sean, I wanted to give us a little taste of Marco Rubio's Twitter account because he said something that I think gels really nicely with what you said, Phil. So yesterday, I'm going to read this tweet. He said, Biden's cabinet picks went to Ivy League schools, have strong resumes, attend all the right conferences, and will be polite and orderly caretakers of America's decline. Seemed like it kind of tied into what you were talking about with Biden, Phil, but he goes on to talk about a lot of nonsense later in the tweet. But that first part I thought was gold and maybe summarizes a little bit. It's like being right for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I just want to say that there's one part that's really interesting and important, I think, to take stock of, as much as like, I think Jarrod is absolutely right. Like, it's like when you look at Biden's pick, it's like, the first woman, like all these first women candidates, right? Like the first Latino that like could now deport immigrants, right? But it also is to recognize that I think white supremacy and racism is the Achilles heel of America in such a way that it's like hundreds of years and political representation has lagged so behind, right? That, whether, whatever critiques we have of it, right, that there is an excitement to some degree about a Kamala Harris, right? Even though people know fully and are fully aware of like her history and the fact that she was a prosecutor, and, that her policies have actually worked against working class Black and brown people, right? But I think in that way, that representation also captures just like the blatant racism of America, right? And I think that's kind of important, right? To recognize, right? Without kind of some, falling into this trap of just like critiquing identity politics. Like it does capture something about just like racism in America that I think it's kind of important to acknowledge. And also that people voted against Trump. And I think just as the focus has been so much on just like all the white voters that went for Trump, I think it's also important to recognize that the people that voted against Trump were voting against like white supremacy, racism, right? So I think there is a lot of space for, left to think differently about racism and race in America. That's not what the liberals have been doing all along, right? It's not what the Democrats do. It's not just like the politics of racial representation, but that's where we're at, right? I don't know. I think that's important.
I'm interested in bringing this focus back to the summer, specifically how increasing and intensifying conditions of racialization, of intensifying proletarianization, were reflected in what we saw over these moments and over these movements that we experience in this hot summer, as Jarrod and Jana, as you put it.
Well, just briefly, I think one significant thing that I touched on a second ago, but could be dug into a little bit more, is just the fact that what happened this summer was a mass phenomenon. It had mass participation. It was extremely popular. That's registered in like opinion polls and things like that, but it's also registered just by the fact that like every single American city was on fire, and the amount of people who came out to like, if not light those fires, at least be there and cheer them on, was pretty substantial. And if you contrast that to like all this far right stuff, I think it's pretty clear that there's a divide there where we had like this mass movement that was, if not like left wing, it was maybe like left leaning in the sense that most people were out there and they understood their purpose as opposition to the present way the world is organized, but also specifically the racial dimension of that present world. And they're there to reject racism, however they kind of conceptualize that. And the fact that they supported varying degrees of kind of intense confrontation in the name of that opposition. And what that really kind of signals, I think, is that you have to engage with these sort of things in order to have something like that mass impetus. I think that one really counterintuitive thing for a lot of people is the fact everyone imagines that a far right movement in the US is going to organize itself along traditional lines of white supremacy. I don't think it will. I don't think it'll organize along traditional lines of white supremacy. I think it's still probably correct to call it like a white supremacist movement in the future, but there's a few things that are going to look very different about it, just based on US demographic trends and also the things that we've seen in these newest far right movements. It's going to be multiracial is the first thing. The far right is going to be multiracial in the future in the US. So it's going to have some different conceptualization of those sort of divides. And what we've started to see a little bit more of is something that maybe not like a class emphasis, but something like what was pointed out earlier, like this kind of anti-urban, multicultural, anti-cosmopolitan kind of politics that it kind of coheres around, which is all kind of has all these racial dog whistles in it, but isn't like explicit like white supremacy in the classical sense. So I think that we have to look at the ways that the far right might begin to engage with stuff like that, and that where we might get a new kind of far right that doesn't look the way that we would expect it to look. And I think that that's hinted at by some other things that people ostensibly on the left might be positioning themselves around, but like some of the more ominous features that sat behind, like the Bernie Sanders program, for example, of like kind of nationalist focus on national industry, for example. Those are the sort of bases that could potentially build on. And the fact that there was, I don't think that this is, so part of this was a, like kind of the mythic figure of the outside agitator, white supremacist coming to Minnesota and breaking shit. I don't think that that's, that myth is completely a myth and false, and it's been demonstrated how it's been used to crush the revolt and stuff like that. At the same time, I think that people aren't necessarily accounting for some of the weird participation that did happen from people whose politics might not be far right, but are not like necessarily good. that where their politics was kind of messy, and that they would maybe in some other historical moment have been in the far right, but now we're just coming out to kind of, you know, confront, they don't like the police either, but they're also kind of on the right wing of things. And I think there was a little bit more participation in those registers than people fully acknowledge. And that, again, isn't just necessarily like white people. It could also be culturally conservative forces from other, you know, ethnic groups in the US.
Yeah, if I could jump on that and distill these kind of two topics that we've been kicking around, one of which I would say is how these small kind of political minoritarian tendencies actually can get legs. And the other is, you know, this idea of like, what is it about the crisis that's going to push, you know, everyday people, to use a terrible expression, to, you know, take some kind of dramatic action. And so I would like to kind of change the focus a little bit to our friends in the defund the police movement, who have been much maligned, I think, by the more street-oriented leftists who are going out to these things all the time and do not want to immediately translate their insurrection into policy. And I completely empathize with that. However, I think that we should look at the hard work that a lot of US abolitionists have done since the Black Lives Matter movement to build hegemony in these small pockets of American society, to such an extent that when this movement kicked off, when there were lots of people in the streets saying, "We're so fucking mad, they killed that man. Also, I lost my job. Also, there's this pandemic and I'm not allowed to go anywhere," right? The abolitionists who have been working, you know, for years to craft this particular vision and view of American society were right there. They were willing to give a name to people's problems. They were willing to direct people's anger at specific targets. And for better or worse, defund the police as a political horizon went from a small fringe topic of this kind of like abolitionist conference circuit that had been practiced in these local campaigns, you know, and maybe in LA and New York, to a national issue that just about every politician feels that they have to respond to. And, you know, I've heard from a lot of comrades recently who are kind of grumbling about, oh, you know, well, most American abolitionists are actually social democrats. And it's just like, well, yeah, I mean, that's completely true. But if we know so much more about politics than them, how did the more revolutionary minded folks get blown off the field by these people? And to my mind, we can also look at how the alt-right was able to cultivate a kind of a successful, for a short amount of time, package that combined basically a definition of why people were mad, a name for the problem, and basic solutions to take. And I'm talking, of course, about the early days of the Trump candidacy. And that didn't last for very long, but I think we can learn a lot from how these folks operated. And also, I think that there is a lot within this kind of this social democratic, anti-police, anti-prison milieu that we could really work with and say like, okay, we too do not want a society that's based on repression and human disposability. We want a place defined by, free association, in which, all lives truly matter. And I think that there's a lot that we can do with the horizon that these abolitionists have brought to the struggle. And in the very least, we can learn from their successes. Zhanna, do you have anything that you want to add? Am I doing a good job outlining kind of our orientation to this?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I do acknowledge where I think some of us kind of in the ultra left, there's like this frustration where like social democracy is the horizon, right? It's like, even people who were like really excited about Bernie Sanders were not necessarily excited because of whatever program he offered, but mostly because millions of people were drawn around to socialism, right? I mean, when would have Americans been, would identify, I mean, obviously we know he's not a socialist, but like at one moment in American life, like would millions of people be totally comfortable identifying with the socialists, right? So again, like I think the Bernie moment was really significant for the abolitionists, right? Like outside of, it's like we've entered this moment of crisis. The social democrats have the language to talk about it, right? They say like, hey, this crisis is about one of inequality, right? So they show these charts of wealth inequality, racial inequality, and say, what we really need to do is like redistribute wealth, right? So we need like to tax, we need to defund the police, we need to take from your local police precinct, which is getting a lot of money and military equipment, and we need to give it to underfunded schools, right? So social democracy, right, recognizes the inequality in American life, is able to then offer a program of like redistribution, right? So in that sense, is like we could agree to some extent, right? But then, yeah, I think I agree. Is in the sense, how do I frame this? So it's like, how do we work with the fact that social democracy is a horizon, right? Of movements. And I think it's important to recognize that people's politics and politicization changes, right? So I think that when we talk about like the abolitionist crew or people who are really inclined towards defund the police, I think that includes a hodgepodge of people, right? I think there's like just so many people who were like ultra leftist supported Bernie. I would say there are people within that crew who see that as kind of the politics that just motivates a lot of people, right? And there's kind of maybe a hope of like, I don't know, taking the horse to the water, where it's like we kind of push the limits of social democracy, say, oh, you see how impossible it is, right? And to some degree, I think that has kind of been the ultra left orientation, right? To say, all right, like to be patient with the defund campaigns and to say, well, let's see how far it gets you, right? And to look at cities and to look at how incapable they have been of taking up any of the defund demands, right? I mean, the most that they will produce is just reshuffling of money within police departments and creating, like just nicer termed community policing efforts, right? So it's like I think the strength of kind of the ultra left perspective to some degree, and the importance of the dialogue between the groups is like, it's like we could kind of, we know the limits of that, right? I don't know.
If I could jump in on top of that, I think that we often talk about these things in kind of two slightly different registers. We sort of automatically, I think, tend to discuss them in terms of, like Jarrod briefly mentioned this word hegemony. Just for context for viewers who might not be as familiar with it, part of the background of that term is specifically talking about what's called like cultural hegemony, where your sort of set of arguments and ways of looking at the world just spread, you would say like discursively, which basically just means how people talk about things or present them or represent them. And we've been trained to really think about this idea of kind of power and politics in these cultural terms, that cultural dimension of hegemony, of cultural hegemony, of discursive hegemony, of how we talk about stuff. But there's at the root of all of that, and I would argue that this really applies to the role of these defund kind of abolitionists in the present moment, is a more material type of intervention of how people lay the groundwork for people to listen to them in the first place, and it's through action. I think there's an easy way we could summarize the central point of what I'm saying here. It's basically that politics, politicization, or however you want to say it, but politics doesn't enter a person through their ears. It doesn't enter through their mind. It enters through the body. It's a matter of it's learned by the hand, right? It's politics is the education of the body through struggle, and that's really where you get people going through political transformations.
That was part one of our discussion with Zhandarka Kurti, Jarrod Shanahan, and Phil Neel. Thanks for listening to Cinder Bloc Radio, and stay tuned for part two.